This is the Mchose Jet75. It's a brand new budget Hall effect gaming keyboard that was released in early March. But is it worth your money, or should you look somewhere else? But before we get into the video, I do want to mention that this keyboard was sent out to me by Mchose, but I'm not being paid, and every opinion given is mine and mine alone. So without further ado, let's get into the unboxing of the Jet75. So the first thing you'll see in the box is the keyboard itself, packaged really nicely. On top of it is a pretty nice plastic dust cover, and under the dust cover are a few manuals. In the accessories box, there's a few things, with the first being 2 extra switches, a pretty standard unbranded keycap and switch puller, and a surprisingly long USB-C to USB-A cable. Now with all that out of the way, let's get into the build of the Jet75. The entire case of the Jet75 is made from a strong plastic which has essentially zero flex, which is surprising especially for a keyboard on the more budget side of things. The top of it has a super sleek looking border that I think is a perfect in between, and it also seems to have more texture than the rest of the case for some reason. On the bottom right next to the arrow keys is the Mchose logo with RGB lights behind it, but unfortunately there doesn't seem to be a way to change the color of the lights. So even if you change the lighting on the rest of the keyboard, the logo will always be cycling through the rainbow. The case also gives this keyboard a pretty comfortable typing experience, but if you prefer even more of an angle, you can use the double stage feet on the bottom of the keyboard at full height or half height, depending on what you find most comfortable. At the very bottom are 4 small rubber feet to reduce the keyboard from sliding around. And lastly on the back is a USB-C port for the detachable cable. Moving back up to the top are these gorgeous topographic keycaps. Made from a double shot PBT material, which makes these pretty strong and resilient to oils. The keycaps have a very slight texture to them, which feels pretty nice. The cherry profile and the overall look of them are beautiful, with the translucent topographic lines, which lets the north-facing RGB diodes below the switches shine through. Speaking of the RGB diodes, they get pretty bright and can be customized a lot in the Mchose web software. You can customize the lighting to almost any color you could possibly think of, as well as choose from any one of the 20 lighting effects. Now when it comes to the switches in the Jet75, you have 2 options. You can either go for the Starburst magnetic switches, or the ones that I have, the Kale magnetic God switches. They both have similar travel distance, with the Starburst having 3.4mm travel, and the Kale God switches having a 3.4mm travel. They both have a really impressive lifespan of 100 million clicks, and while I haven't gotten personal experience with the Starburst switches, I can still go over the Kale switches. From my experience using this keyboard, these switches have felt absolutely amazing. They have a pretty low amount of force needed to press them down, which in my opinion feels really nice, with a hard bottoming out feeling and a super quick release back up to the top when letting go. Honestly, out of all my keyboards, both of my Mchose keyboards have some of the most satisfying switches to use. The God switches in my Jet75 feel great along with their sound, which actually, here's a quick sound test. I personally love the sound and feel of these switches, but if for some reason you don't, the PCB is hot swappable, meaning you can just pop out the switches that are in it and put any of the compatible ones back in. The Jet75 is compatible with any of the Hall effect switches that are in any of Mchose's other Hall effect keyboards. When it comes to switches that aren't compatible, they will fit and they technically will work, but they won't have the keyboard's advertised precision, as they're not specifically made and calibrated to this keyboard specifically. Another part of the Jet75 that I absolutely love are the stabilizers. They're plate mounted and pre-lubed from the factory, which makes them feel super smooth and removes any pinging or scraping of any kind. The spacebar specifically feels so satisfying to use when gaming. The top plate is made from aluminum alloy, which definitely adds to the hard bottoming out feeling that I really love, but it also contributes to the impressively solid build quality that I mentioned earlier. And to go along with it, the PCB and top plate are also gasket mounted, which makes the typing experience a bit more bouncy, but it also removes any unnecessary sounds from making it back to the case. Along with the gasket's sound isolation, there's also a plethora of silicone and foam pads throughout the rest of the case, which makes the keyboard sound really full and not hollow at all. The Jet75 has a pulling rate of 8,000 Hz, which is quite impressive, especially for a keyboard at this price. The pulling rate of this keyboard also allows for the latency to be 0.1 milliseconds, which is great for any game where every single millisecond can count. One thing I do want to mention is that when first using this keyboard, it will come at 1000 Hz pulling rate, but you could choose between 1000, 2000, 4000, and obviously 8,000 in the performance section of the Mchose web software. Speaking of, now we're going to go over all the specific Hall effect features of this keyboard. The first feature is adjustable actuation. In a normal mechanical switch, the actuation isn't changeable because it's a physical contact point that obviously you can't change. However, with Hall effect switches, because they use magnets to determine how far the switch is actually pressed down, you can change the actuation point. This lets you change the actuation point anywhere between 3.4 millimeters or a full key press, all the way up to 0.1 millimeters, which is essentially barely clicking the switch. You can customize the actuation point on every single key individually as well, meaning if you have a key binded to a special ability or an alt, you can change that switch's actuation point to a really deep key press to not accidentally click it. But since in most competitive games, latency is your worst enemy, you can also set your movement keys to 0.1 millimeters or around there to remove any physical latency of pressing it down. The one downside to setting your actuation super high is that now your reset point is all the way up at that top, so it's going to take a lot longer for you to be able to let go to be able to press it again. However, with the adjacent feature Quick Trigger, you can reduce or even fully remove that liftoff latency. Quick Trigger allows you to have any switch that acts as if it hit the reset point if you let go of any pressure. This feature also has a slider, so you can put it all the way down if you want any bit of pressure that let go acts as if you hit the reset point, or you can set it a relatively normal distance, which isn't super low but definitely isn't high, to where you do have to let go a little bit so you don't accidentally let go sometimes, which is how it is with a few other keyboards. The next feature is SOCD. Normally when pressing two of the opposite movement keys in games, your character obviously comes to a complete stop. However, with SOCD, you combine two of the opposite movement keys together, whether it be A or D or W or S. When doing this, the last one of those two keys that you pressed will take priority and disable the other one, essentially meaning you can just immediately turn directions. As I'm sure you can probably imagine, this feature can be extremely useful in most competitive FPS games. One thing to note is that you can't use this in CSGO, as Valve saw it as an unfair advantage. You won't be like banned from the game necessarily, but you will be kicked from your specific game that you're in, so I'd probably avoid that, but any other game is perfectly fine. The next feature is called Rappy Snappy. It's very similar to SOCD, but instead of being the last key that was pressed, it's whichever key of those two is at a lower actuation point. Personally, I don't think this is nearly as useful as SOCD in most situations, but it's still there if for some reason you prefer it. And lastly is DKS. DKS allows you to have up to 4 separate functions on a single key, meaning you could have any function trigger at either the actuation point, when bottoming out, when lifting from the bottom, and reaching the reset point. Obviously, you don't have to have 4 functions. You can have around 2, which is actually the most useful, because if you set this feature on W and drag it across all the actuations, and then bind your sprint button in the game to a full key press, then you can walk and sprint in the same key press. So those were all the main software features that I wanted to go over today. But before we get into my final thoughts and the price of this keyboard, I do want to go over a few extra software features that I didn't go over yet. There's a spot to test your inputs and see if they're doing what you want them to do. In the performance setting tab, there's a toggle for switching to Mac inputs if you're planning on using this keyboard on a Mac device. You can manually calibrate the keyboard when updating the firmware or when swapping out the current switches to maintain the advertised precision. But there's also a setting called adaptive calibration, which Mchose claims actively calibrates the switches while you're using it, which is pretty cool. There's also a few other performance settings that I'm not specifically going to go over today, but if you get the keyboard, you could play around with them and test them out if you want. The Mchose Jet75 comes in at a price of $60 when bought with the Starburst switches and in the white colorway, but can get up to $90 when bought with the Kale God switches and with either the white or black topographic design. I've absolutely loved my time with the Jet75, as I'm sure you gathered from this video, and out of my many keyboards, this keyboard is probably one of my favorites, especially when gaming. But with that being said, what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments. So whether you watch this video for entertainment or you're actually looking for a keyboard to buy, I appreciate you being here. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next videos.